Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is briefly the current enforcement system, how it works. So procedurally, what happens, a little bit about what we know of the inspectorate, then looking at some levels of compliance with the sectoral determinations, particularly on wage compliance, but with some mention of informality as well. And then a note on partial compliance, which is when you see sort of people complying even though there's a limited enforcement capacity. And then a few issues that we think from the research we've done are important to consider for the inspection and enforcement services in South Africa. Okay, so enforcement is actually quite procedurally well developed in the sectoral determination case at least. There's a kind of clear system and a set of procedures that are usually followed by inspectors. So inspectors are housed in labor centers around the country, and they form part of the inspection and enforcement services, which is an arm of the Department of Labor. And what they do is they go around to workplaces and conduct inspections, and these can be of two types. They can be proactive or reactive. Proactive is when they kind of just pick a business that they want to go and inspect out of the blue, and reactive is when they get a complaint which is lodged at a labor center which they're responding to. Typically, though, these reactive inspections are placed by employees who have left the job at which they are reporting about. So this is really how it works in a kind of simplified manner. The inspector will show up at a workplace. They will look at pay slips. They will interview a random selection of employees. They will speak to the employer, and they are looking for not only compliance with wage rates for a particular sectoral determination, but they're also interested in number of hours worked, whether the overtime pay is correct, whether workers are getting sick leave, whether they have a written contract, are they registered for the UIF, and so on. If they find some sort of non-compliance, then they give the employer what's called a written undertaking, which gives them a list of what they have to fix, and then they come back and do a follow-up inspection. If that still hasn't encouraged them to comply, then they get served with a compliance order, and if that doesn't work, then that employer gets taken to the labor court. One problem is that the labor court process is quite slow, so these cases can take a long time to be resolved. So briefly, just as a kind of look at what employers face if they violate the law. So these are fines that don't relate to underpayment of wages, so they would relate to other things about other things contained in the BCEA. So it depends a lot on whether you've had a previous violation or not, and it's usually per employee. And these are actually, sorry, it's cut off at the bottom, but these are actually updated. So that I think they've been nominally the same for about 10 years, and they were recently updated. So these are the updated figures. And then for fines involving underpayment, it's usually calculated, or it is calculated as a percentage of the underpayment for each employee. So that's what we're talking about, that employers face if they violate the law. Okay, what do we know about these inspectors who form part of the IES and conduct these inspections? So we did a survey of about 20% of the full cohort of inspectors. They're kind of in their late 30s in general. It's relatively even split between men and women. Most of them only have a matric education. That's their income bracket. They work a kind of regular full-time number of hours per week. A lot of them have actually been working in the inspectorate for some time. Then inspections per month on average is around 22, so there will be 22 workplaces per month. We had a question on firm size, so kind of what you might think of as a medium-sized firm was the average size of the firm inspected. And then they obviously travel kind of variable distances to go out and inspect different firms in different sectors. And I'll come back to some of these issues and how they play a role in the probability of kind of compliance or non-compliance. So here's a table which is an overview of the latest administrative data that we got from the Department of Labor showing the allocation of inspectors, so these are just labor inspectors and their team leaders. There also are occupational health and safety and employment equity inspectors, but so they're not included here. So in total, we have around 1,000 labor inspectors across the whole country, and they are distributed across provinces, as you can see in the first column there. So one thing we wanted to look at was how are they distributed kind of per employee numbers in the province, and that's in the final column here. So one thing that's kind of interesting is that what you see is that the big provinces where there are obviously a lot more firms and a lot more employees, is you don't see a bigger allocation of inspectors in those provinces. So that's maybe something to think about. Okay, just briefly, compliance in general. So we know that from other work, compliance with minimum wage laws in a lot of developing countries is found to be low. So there's some work that has looked at that. This is not, it's obviously not a case of a lack of legislation. There's kind of often quite complex legislation, which may be in part driving the non-compliance. And then one thing that some of this literature does is tries to look at violation, not just in terms of how many people are being paid below the minimum wage, but how far below the minimum wage are they being paid. So what's the kind of overall percentage of workers who are earning below the minimum wage, and how far below are they being underpaid. So that's something that we do. And so here's some figures for South Africa. So this is 2013 data. Again, this is only looking at sectoral determinations and taking into account there may be kind of problems of underreporting, which we acknowledge, but I still agree with Shane, and we have some other kind of anecdotal evidence that non-compliance rates are relatively high. So that column there, which is titled headcount, would be the percentage of workers in each sector that report earning wages below the lowest minimum wage for that sector. And then the second column there called gap is the distance, the average distance below that legislated minimum wage. Okay? So on average, we calculate that about half of workers actually earn lower than the legislated rates for sectoral determinations. One thing we also are interested in is how this correlates with other legislated provisions in the sectoral determinations. So here we divide workers into formal and informal, where formal means having a written contract and being registered for UIF. So those are also self-reported by the interviewee in the household survey. So if you don't have one of those, then you're considered to be informal. So you have to have both to be formal. And so what you can see is the rates of underpayment are a lot lower for people who have a written contract and UIF, and much higher for, so kind of what that suggests is that underpayment of wages goes along with not having a contract and not being registered for UIF, which is sort of what you would expect. Okay, 2 minutes. So another interesting question that we've tried to understand is, in an environment like South Africa's, where you have weak enforcement, how do wages adjust in response to the introduction of a minimum wage? So I'll just give you some evidence from the agricultural sector. Here's a graph of average wages per province. So each of those dots is a province in a given year. And on the y-axis is the level of wages over time on the x-axis. And what you can see there is they move along in kind of a flat pattern, and then that vertical black line is when the minimum wage is introduced. And what you see is not only that they start moving up, so those are the average wages in each province, but that there's some compression. So it kind of suggests that even though we have this limited enforcement, you do see an effect. This is showing basically the same thing, but looking at the gap below how many or the extent to which workers are earning below the minimum wage. So we can come back to that because we don't have time, but essentially it's suggesting the same thing, that we see quite extensive partial compliance, which is employers that are either So some employers are complying fully and paying up to the minimum wage or above, and some are not, or employers are increasing wages but not all the way up to the minimum. So in response to the introduction of the minimum wage law, they increase wages to some extent but not all the way up to the legislated minimum. Okay, so I've got 1 minute to cover stuff on enforcement. One thing to note is that it takes place in a high unemployment environment in South Africa, which creates a possible trade-off where if you enforce too strictly, you may cause a small firm to close, and it seems like inspectors are aware of this. So we asked them whether they would enforce to the letter of the law if they knew that the firm was going to close as a result. And only 30% said that they would do that. Most said they would go and seek kind of advice from a supervisor or take some sort of like long, medium-term action. And then just a note about formal versus informal firms. So a lot of people think that only formal firms get inspected, but actually inspectors are not concerned about the formality of the enterprise per se, but whether there's an employment relationship that's there that they can see, whether these conditions are being met or not. Okay, so 5 key challenges that the inspectorate currently faces. One is resources, so they have a lack of human resources both in number and in skill levels for the inspectors. Some labor centers don't have enough cars, so inspectors can't get out and visit businesses. Sometimes they have to share computers, so there's those kinds of issues. One crucial thing is there's no national case management system, so we don't know, how many cases are opened against a particular employer or, in each province what the rates of success of inspections are. Sorry, I'm being cut off here. Let me just quickly go through this. Another thing is that the system is complex, so that makes it difficult for inspectors, employers, and employees. Certain firms and certain sectors are more difficult to inspect, so taxi is notoriously difficult, private security is also, domestic work, there's no list of domestic work, kind of worker employers, for example. There are also no inspection incentives based on size, so you just have to inspect a certain number of firms per month, so it's in your interest as an inspector then to go to a small firm with fewer workers rather than like whatever, Pick and Pay with 100 workers. That's a lot more time consuming for you probably. We think that the probability of being inspected combined with the fines is not a big deterrent to employers to prevent them from underpaying. And then finally, there are some institutional issues, so there's not really any collaboration between the inspectorate and other organizations which could be providing useful information to them about who's registered as an employee, where to inspect, and so on. And there's not a huge amount of communication between unions and inspectors and other people who would be kind of concerned about these sorts of issues. Okay, that's it. Thank you.